that, he was the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So if you read the annual transition report, that was coming from Eric. And before that, he was at the Stockholm School of Economics. And importantly, Eric has been a real institution builder. He built up the stuff in Stockholm. He built up Safir, one of the major think tanks in Moscow. He's on the board of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and his research on corporate governance and finance and institutions is terrific academic research, and it also has a lot of policy influence. Next, we'll have Roger Myerson, who's the Glenn Lloyd Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. We all probably know that he got a Nobel Prize for his work on mechanism design in 2007, and he's made real important fundamental theoretical contributions on equilibrium refinements and all kinds of things, which we all use when we do applied theory, not only pure theory. And that kind of insight that he has from economic theory has really seems to led him to do quite important policy work. I've seen his work on post-socialist transition economy. He's been at conferences with them. And in the case of the Ukraine, he's traveled there. He's given talks for stressing the importance of bolstering these sort of local democratic institutions, trying to bolster voting, using that as a way of developing trust. And really using theory to understand the deep causes of the crisis. Tima Malovanov, he's my colleague in the economics department at the University of Pittsburgh. We were lucky to get him, and he started as a real deep theorist. He worked with a guy Troger on the problem of informed principles. So he really dealt with open questions that were initiated by Roger Myerson and Eric Maskin and Jean Tirole on the endogenous selection of institutions in situations where there's all kinds of frictions. And so one of the sort of nice results you get from his theoretical work is that in a world with agency problems and really a world that lacks a benevolent planner, good institutions can emerge endogenously under sort of very robust conditions, and that work on theory, that on endogenous institutions and in a world where the people in power are not necessarily so benevolent, and also his own personal connections led him to do this work in the Ukraine, where he's developed this blog and is raising money and supporting academic research and really doing important stuff. Finally, I'll introduce Gerard Roland, who's the Morris Cox Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He's done major work on the theory of economic transitions, the political economy, legislature, cultures, fiscal decentralization. So he does top academic work that has real serious policy relevance. He published an influential book on transition, an influential book on European legislatures, and is bringing that to the undergraduate level with a textbook which showing the importance of institutions and culture for development. And his applied theoretical work sort of has led him to do very important policy work. He's deeply involved in working with people in Korea on planning the economic transition in North Korea, on the blessed moment when the political situation makes that transition possible. And finally, we added Andrei Kirilenko, and Tima will introduce him.
Andrei Kirilenko is a professor of practice of finance at MIT Sloan and a co-director of Center of Finance. Professor Kirilenko has, prior to MIT, has extended experience in policy institutions. He has worked for at least 12 years at IMF and other places, and he has been deeply involved with reforms in Ukraine, and also was very supportive, has been very supportive, continue to be supportive of our group and other groups which are trying to provide policy advice in Ukraine.
Okay, thanks. So we're gonna, each speaker's gonna speak for 12 minutes, what gives us around an hour. Roger Myerson will start.
Okay.
And then that gives us almost an hour for discussion. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me say, my involvement with Ukraine really begins in 2007 when I met someone at just a reception, a function, who worked at a think tank in Stockholm, who announced to me that evening that he had helped to write the Ukrainian Constitution, and he then told me that his team had come up with a brilliant idea. I don't know, I think he may have been involved, he was probably involved in the revision of the Constitution in 2004, but it might have been in the 90s, I think it was 2004, because he said, we came up with this great new idea for a new form of separation of powers, where the national government would be run by the Prime Minister, who was responsible to the National Assembly, the Verkhovna Rada, and the President is popularly elected, and he would control the local governments. And I was shocked. I said I hope I was gentle, but I indicated that I'd never heard such a stupid a constitutional structure with all the problems, geopolitical transition from Soviet system, to add on top of that a totally dysfunctional constitutional system, was just, now what was my instinct? Was a horror. In some sense, you're getting the worst of both of federal separation of powers, because to me the most important thing. Let me back up and say, in this September, I had the privilege of sitting at a couple of breakfast meetings with Eric that Eric chaired in Kiev, where people were talking about reform, and there's an enormous number of questions of reform. I want you to know, and I think this is an important proposition to put forward, and I concede that this is debatable, but to me, among the 4, 5, or 6 different fundamental reform projects that you can think might be absolutely pressing for Ukraine to be pushing ahead with, as many of them as it can, I believe decentralization, political constitutional decentralization, is absolutely the #1. Now, others can disagree, and I respect that. But let me at least explain why I put the case. Constitutional structures of power come first. Reform of the rules of bureaucracy become pointless unless they are sustained by political leaders. So political leadership is of the essence of the matter. My belief is that I just say Daniel Treisman should have been on this panel, but he couldn't make it in the end. He's written a book criticizing theories of federalism. A lot of political scientists and economists think federalism or decentralization. In Ukraine, people don't want to say federalism; they want to say decentralization, even speaking in English. And I don't know why, but I'm happy to do that. But federalism or political decentralization has a lot of fans for a lot of reasons. I should say my paper on the virtues of decentralization was published just in time to get criticized in Daniel Treisman's book. I think if you read, I think he has brilliant criticisms of every other theory, but I think if you look up My Name in the Index in his book on architecture of government, I think you'll find that his criticism is rather weak, and I've said that to Daniel, and he smiled. Other than that, I think his book is really magnificent in shooting down weak theories of federalism. But let me just say what the core theory. I want to mention at least 3 or 4 different virtues of federalism. But to me, the #1 that I was thinking of that night in 2007 was that look, democracy is about voters having a choice among alternative candidates. We're at the economics meetings. Federalism is about lowering barriers to entry into national politics. That's the idea. Democracy is a competitive system. Competitive systems that function imperfectly. A key parameter is barriers to entry. Freedom of speech is a way of lowering barriers to entry into political discourse, of course, and a variety of other ways. Freedom of assembly. But once you get beyond that, the ability, competitors for national power needed a chance to prove themselves, and an autonomous, locally elected local government is in most successful democracies regularly have people run for national leadership, whether that's prime minister or president, who have first proven themselves as mayor of Milan or governor of Georgia, or in local offices before they, governor of California, before they run for national office. And not everyone does, but it lowers barriers to entry. So democracy is about voters having a choice among alternative candidates who are trusted to exercise power responsibly. And when such trusted leadership is lacking, democracy is disappointing and fragile. I'm looking at something that I wrote with Timothy earlier on. And this essential supply of trusted democratic leadership can develop best in responsible institutions of local government, where successful local leaders can prove their qualifications to become strong candidates for higher office. To put it another way, if there's a bad equilibrium. My paper in the Quarterly Journal of Political Science in 2006 showed that in a unitary state you could have a bad equilibrium in which voters are totally cynical about any political leader, which may sound like Ukraine. And everybody knows that it's easy for people out of power to make speeches saying, "No, put me in power and I'll serve the people." But then if you expect them to behave just like everybody else, so talk is cheap when you're out of power. You don't want to mobilize for them if you think that they don't mean it. So talk is cheap. So how do we give people? But people who are already in power in a unitary state have no desire to raise expectations. The motive to want to raise voters' expectations and the ability to do it is only there when you have elected offices at multiple levels of power. So people who have won some power at lower levels have an incentive to try to raise voters' expectations and say, elect me and you'll get something better. And whereas when you take all your local governments, as this man told me in 2007 they'd done in Ukraine, and you let the president control all responsible local executive offices, then the president is the national politician under any system. Regardless of what you think of this or any recent president of Ukraine, the president is always going to be a national politician who has a vested interest in not having new entry into national political competition. He's already at the top, he or she. So he's the last thing he's going to do is try to appoint people to give them a chance to prove their virtues. By giving the centrally elected president control of the local governments, the whole point of local government, from my perspective, was being nullified. I think a second virtue of decentralized democracy, which is very important to talk about, is the decentralized democracy can make the state stronger in itself. Why? Because when local, or let me say decentralized politics, when real power, some share of real power is devolved to people whose positions depend on local politics, you have a way of guaranteeing that in every region there are some people who have local political support who can mobilize in defense of the system. They have a proven ability to mobilize for political action, local forces for local political action, and they have a stake in the power in the country. What we all saw happen in Donetsk and Luhansk as it descended into anarchy last spring was nobody could stand up and say, nobody had the motive and ability to bring a crowd to the squares of Donetsk and Luhansk for support of the political system. Once a regime in Kiev had been installed, which was going to have all the central power, all power at the center at Kiev, and it was supported by citizens in other regions of Ukraine. So, in fact, although a veto system where local officials, as in the Polish Republic of 1790, giving a liberum veto, allowing local leaders to have a veto over national politics, weakens a state. Devolving some local power to people whose positions depend on local administration can actually strengthen a state, and in ways that are directly relevant to, let me say, a third reason. As I began to understand the Ukraine system in more detail, I realized, let me give you a sketch, a simple game theoretic model to show how how the particular structure of Ukraine's constitution, giving the president direct control over the chief executives, over the executive authorities in the oblasts, can create regional antagonism. When the president, think of the game, you're running for president, I'm running for president against you. We're going to make, suppose we can make credible promises about how we will do things about how we'll exercise power in election. And suppose the president has other powers, but suppose, and this is not a bad approximation, the primary constitutional power we will have as president is the power to control local executives. Now, the question is, do we, one, promise to make a credible promise to the voters to appoint oblast governors who will administer well and will supervise them and make sure that they provide good government? Or do we sell the office to the highest bidder, to the guy who will offer us the most crony, somebody who will offer us money or political support in order to win the office? Do we sell the governorship, or do we promise the voters good government? You can't do both. Let's assume, I mean, you could if you could promise everything to everybody, but those are contradictory promises. Which do we do if we have to make a credible commitment and that people have rational expectations about our promises? The answer is, it's a mixed strategy. Where you expect you could get a lot of votes, there you'd like to make, if you promise to govern well, you want to promise good government. But where you think a majority of the people are not, even if you promise them good government, they probably would prefer some other local hero, then you want to sell that province to the highest bidder because you're not going to get many votes anyway. So now you see what happens is, any province once I'm identified as, say, from the east or the west of the country, whichever I'm identified at, the other side, I know even if I promised good government, I wouldn't get very many votes. So those are the provinces I want to sell for political support. So now nobody in those provinces wants to vote for me. In fact, everybody's going to be horrified if I win because they know I've just sold them out. So what I'm trying to say is there is no history in the sorry, sad history of this part of the world, like other parts of the world. There have been plenty of conflicts and plenty of hatred between different groups, but there is no history of conflict between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine before our time. That, I believe, is an endogenous result of a constitutional power that gives the president the power to appoint local governments. I am concerned that in local government, in decentralization, in the discussion on decentralization reforms today, that the president in particular is going to be surrounded by people who will say to him, oh, don't give up the power to appoint local oblast governors, or if you do, appoint instead a guy with a veto power who can be like a governor because he can say no to anything. I fear that the discussion about decentralization to municipalities is becoming focal in the debate because the president does not appoint the municipal heads. They are locally elected. On the other hand, their budgets depend line by line on the Verkhovna Rada, so the National Assembly, the Verkhovna Rada, it would be losing power from really empowering local governments. And so there I have my three most important reasons for federalism in Ukraine, and nothing has to do with local taste, better experimentation, or better local public investment, which are which were the other standard theories. So let me stop there.
Thanks. All right, so thank you, Rector. So we'll just have the five talks, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So next we'll have Tima.
All right. So let me be to the point. So there is an expectation, consistent expectation in Ukraine that there will be at some point radical reforms. That's what people expected after the new government came to power. That's what people expected again when the new president came to power. Again, the new parliament, the new ministers. I have just returned from Ukraine. My impression is that there will be no radical reforms in Ukraine ever. They will continue to muddle through. And there are serious systemic issues why that's going to be the case. Let me try to sort of identify these reasons and try to argue that decentralization actually will help to resolve and increase the capacity of Ukraine to move forward. Okay, first of all, currently the only true competition, political competition in Ukraine is present in Kyiv. Okay, there is a true competition between the parliament, multiple groups in the parliament, the president and the prime minister. There's the conflict embedded in the constitution that not only between the national and local level, which creates a conflict between the prime minister and the president. The president controls the local level, and the Prime Minister controls the national level. But also on the national level, there is a conflict which creates dysfunctionality within the government. The President is responsible for the law enforcement agencies, whereas the Prime Minister is responsible for the economic ministers mostly. On top of that, the President has managed to strengthen his power by installing the people who are foreign-based, but they're loyal to the President in key economic ministries, and they're being sabotaged now by people who are loyal to the Prime Minister. The President and the Prime Minister are constantly fighting for, there will be local elections soon. They both have parties, and there are smaller parties too, who are pivotal players, so they are trying to appear well, and what is happening now is that each of them is competing on introducing new laws which are populist and look good. For instance, there is a recent example. There was a judicial reform law which was presented in the parliament and worked upon for maybe 2 or so months. That law was blocked in the parliament by the party which is supporting the President. The President introduced a new law which gives strong overseeing powers to the President to appoint judges. So the President is trying to appear good to the public. At the same time, he's trying to strengthen his power by introducing law and destabilize the opponents by saying, oh, you don't want judicial reform, that doesn't look good. Now, the Prime Minister is doing the same thing. He's introducing laws about fighting offshores, which are not systemic and in fact distortive. And the other political players are doing similar. So there is a dysfunctionality, and this dysfunctionality is caused by the fact that no one is responsible for the entire body. So the President can always say, oh, I was elected on the mandate to reform Ukraine, but I'm not truly responsible, I'm incapable because of the Prime Minister controlling the government. And then the Prime Minister now can say, well, I'm incapable because the President introduced this law, these new ministers, and he also controls the law enforcement agencies which are corrupt and not doing anything. The President has incentives not to clean up corruption because he wants the heads of the law enforcement agencies to be dependent on him, to be corrupt. And therefore that provides him a possibility to fight, to fight in this politics. He truly doesn't want. Now the Prime Minister has other reasons. So it's a pretty dysfunctional system. Okay. The new thing, which is crucially different, is that there is no single group. Even these two people do not control the parliament anymore. Okay? The parliament, of course, is full of vested interests, but it's competing vested interests. And there are also a small number of very vocal people who are truly trying to be patriotic and move Ukraine forward. So that makes it difficult. So we observe the budget, we observe the interesting process. After the elections, it took a month for the coalition to be formed, and it took another 2 weeks for the government to be formed, and then it took a week for the budget to be imposed on the parliament. Instead, so the quality of the budget you expect if it took it several days. Actually, the insiders say that the political decisions which were needed to make the budget were given 2 days before the budget was formed. So the clerks and the ministers only had 2 days to give the budget to the parliament, and the parliament had 4 days to pass it. Okay, so the quality of the budget remains to be seen, but there are early signs that not everything adds up, and there are interesting things. But there are also good things in that budget. So the budget is fundamentally decentralization budget. That is a big surprise. So there are a lot of financing has been given to the low level, and that's something no one expected. It's not clear why this really happened. It shouldn't have happened, despite because it's not in the interest of anyone. But I think the country is preparing for the local elections. And if there is a chance to introduce the competition at the local level through local elections and replicate what has happened in the parliament in Ukraine, where you cannot really pass anything behind the closed doors anymore, I think that would be a major step forward for Ukraine. Okay? The decentralization is crucially important because we need to take this, sort of behind the door lounge decision making outside of Kyiv. So today, it's truly 2 blocks in the country, Sadova and Institutskaya, where you need to walk between 2 or 3 buildings to decide on everything. Okay, the entire debate on the country is done within 2 blocks within the country. That has to be done. That has to be removed. That spreads around the country. Another danger is that people in the regions, they don't understand that the parliament is different. They just don't see it. They don't have enough capacity to see the subtleties, how the parliament has changed. And so what they see really that the corrupt judges or the corrupt prosecutors have not been removed. They also see that new appointees often are more corrupt. So the people, sometimes the prices for bribes go up for infrastructure, for access to infrastructure. The prices went up. It's not clear if it means there is less corruption because it's not clear what the volume is, but the fact is that the prices went up by new appointees. Okay, so now that means that people are frustrated, and if you decentralize political competition to the local level, people will see that there is a real change coming. You need to demonstrate that to the public, because the public expects radical reforms. They're not going to happen anyway, because not even because of the people, but because of, it's 25 years of vested interests, okay? They're everywhere. The deputy of a deputy is always working for someone we don't even know who that person, is working for. It's not that the minister who comes in with 5 people can change the minister. There's 2,000 people and half of them are on payroll of different, groups. All right, so it's not going to change over a day, and they will be sabotaged. The good people will be sabotaged all the time. So you need to demonstrate to the public that something fundamental is changing. So far, only the upper middle class sees that things are changing in the top. But the country doesn't see that, and there's a lot of frustration in the region. So decentralization might be a way of conveying to the public that things have fundamentally changed. That's another reason why you want to decentralize political competition. Thank you.
Next we have Gerard Roland.
Okay, so thank you. So the topic of the session was decentralization. That was decided, about a bit less than a year ago when this was a crucial thing. So it's still a crucial thing, but I'll try. I agree actually with a lot of what Roger and Timothy said. So I probably want to bring maybe a dose of optimism, which might be based partly on my ignorance of many local conditions, but still I'll just go for it. So when I look at the situation in Ukraine, it really makes me think a lot of Georgia. Georgia was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It had a history of failed transition, very weak institutions, etc. And after the Rose Revolution, it was shown that even this corrupt, hopeless country where people didn't trust each other, a radical change and strong elimination of corruption was possible. And so Ukraine has similar starting points. It has a history of failed transition. There's deeply rooted corruption in state and society. There's strong power of oligarchs. So people make this distinction. They're bad oligarchs. They were supporting Yanukovych. They're good oligarchs. But still, the oligarchs. The president is an oligarch. They've been traditionally part of the Russian sphere of influence. But on the positive side, I think it's quite remarkable that Ukraine had 2 revolutions in 10 years against incumbents and the existing system, and despite lots of disappointments, I think the spirit of the Maidan is still alive, and these show really very strong aspirations to democracy and the rule of law. So I'll just, because many of the policies are really, very, full of details, I'll just try to give an overview on 3 basic topics, which I think are important. First, the geopolitical stakes in Ukraine. Second, the institutional reform. So here I totally agree with what Roger said, that institutions are a key if we want to have big changes, and then something about the urgent economic reforms. So on the geopolitical stakes, I think this is something we have to keep in mind. We have to, that Putin, is there next door. He's in Crimea, he's in the Donbass. He wants the Maidan experience to fail and will really do everything he can to achieve this goal. There was an article in the Financial Times last week about a military document for a military strategy in Russia, and it was quite interesting that the 2 main points were threats from political destabilization abroad, read democratization in countries close to Russia, and second, the spillover effects this could have on Russia. So it's quite clear that Putin, to stay in power, which is his main goal, will do everything to destabilize the experience. So if it fails, if reforms don't work, then unfortunately Putin will be proved right, and Ukraine may go back into the Russian sphere of influence. Putin is not only trying to do that, he also sees that one of the reasons that changes happen in Ukraine is that the European Union acts as a democratic magnet, and Putin is actually actively trying to undermine the European Union. So we think Putin is quite unhappy with the fall of the oil price, etc. That's probably true, but I think he really had a good time with the Greek political crisis the other day, because that could be a problem. We're talking about Greek exit again, and the European Union is not doing well in the crisis, and actually there's evidence that there's been Russian support at the extreme right, the extreme left, and it's quite amazing to see the international propaganda on Ukraine being a fascist plot, etc. We just see this everywhere. Now, another geopolitical remark that is important is that Ukraine has more strategic importance to Putin than Georgia has. So Georgia obviously had some geopolitical importance, but Ukraine even more. So Russian destabilization is not going to go away. It cannot be ignored. Third remark is that Russia cares much more about Ukraine than the West. So contrary to the remarks that this was all Western-induced neo-fascist plot, etc., actually, the West was a little bit surprised by what happened. There was again very interesting articles in the New York Times, I think this morning, showing how basically the mass movement surprised European diplomats, etc. So help from the West is going to be limited. So we have to understand that also. So that being said, what does that mean? It means I think that the war against the rebels in the Donbass cannot currently be won by the Ukrainian government. Any escalation will be answered by a counter-escalation. I think that we can be sure of. The best one can probably hope for right now and in the foreseeable future is that the conflict does not expand geographically. And I think that should be a goal for the Ukrainian government, not to let it expand. Of course, supporting Crimea and Donbass is expensive for Russia, and so Putin, is probably reluctant to invade further territory. But there are other forms of destabilization. You can corrupt people, you can blackmail important politicians, business people, you can organize terrorist attacks, they can be temporary incursions, you can go arrest people in Ukraine, even in the Baltics, it has happened recently. So there are lots of forms of destabilization that can happen, and they will happen. So these destabilization efforts should not prevent the Ukrainian government from focusing on the needed institutional and economic reform. That would really be a mistake. So if people focus on fighting Russia and don't focus on the reforms, then actually, they're playing in Putin's hand. So that comes to the subject of institutional changes. So I agree with most of what Roger said, so I'm not going to repeat it. But more broadly, I think the main goal in the reform of the Ukrainian state apparatus is to empower people more. I think this should really be the leitmotif, to empower people more, introduce rule of law, transparency, prevent new forms and occurrences of corruption, and I think that this is a priority. Now, as much as decentralization is important, the way I see things, and partly in response to the sort of disappointing things that Timothy has been telling us about, Ukraine cannot reform without a major constitutional change. And when we think about a constitutional change, introducing more decentralization, checks, balances, and accountability, the process of constitutional change is equally important. The spirit of the Maidan should be used to do an exceptional event, and something like I think the best solution is a constitutional convention. That there should be a constitutional convention, so that it's not the incumbents who are going to decide on the reforms. A constitutional convention with parliamentarians, local authorities, representatives of civil society who are active in the Maidan movement. They would help create a modern democratic constitution for Ukraine. And when you look at histories of countries with successful constitutions, these are constitutions where there's been a focus, people who are supporting it, and then the constitution is legitimate and people can rely on it to solve their conflicts. And so this was the case actually for Germany after World War II, even though the Americans played an important role. So German intellectuals really wanted to avoid Nazism or some form of Nazism to come back. So there was a lot of thinking of people who had been in the opposition. We think of France in 1958. They introduced a constitution that worked relatively well for a number of decades, and think of the U.S. Constitution, etc., etc. So I think that's really. I think we cannot go forward without a broad constitutional change that is not initiated at the top, but that is initiated via an exceptional thing like a constitutional convention. Now, other institutional changes, I'll go very quickly. Some institutional reforms corresponded to the needed economic reforms that are equally urgent, so such as elimination of wasteful agencies, reduction of bureaucracy, strong deregulation, public procurement reform. Judicial reform that was mentioned by Timothy is actually both urgent and fundamental, but actually really a problem. It's really complicated, and it's a major, I think it's a major hurdle for reforms in Ukraine. And it's not clear that there's any simple solution, because judges need to be replaced, new judges need to be appointed. If the new judges are as corrupt as the older ones, then of course we're not going to go forward. But it's messy, but it's fundamental. And so I'd like to make further two remarks on this. First is that the rule of law needs to be implemented from the start. The commitment to the rule of law should become a consensus among all democratic political movements. And so here I think the danger, and I'm basing myself here on the experience of Russia in the 90s, but also partly of Georgia. The danger is that we have some kind of reform Bolshevism, where people think we are the good guys, we chase the bad guys, so now we can do what we want. And so thinking that the good guys can bypass the rule of law, can bypass people who are opposed to reforms, whether through corruption, etc. Because we're the good guys, that you could do all these things, and that's legitimate. You're not going to go forward, and you think you can go faster, but in the end, it's not going to lead to credible institutional change. Active audits of the state sector to establish credibility, tax audits for oligarchs, rich Ukrainians, high publicity trials for high-level corruption, especially recent cases. And given the weakness of the judicial system, I think it's right to prioritize new cases, corruption, to show that there's zero tolerance. And then just very quickly, things that they did in Georgia, so minimizing face-to-face interactions between bureaucrats and the public, introduce cameras in public offices, digitalize as much as possible public services, including taxation, mandatory electronic cash registers in shops, using foreign product certification systems to basically bypass the current ones, subcontract even temporarily some public services abroad. I think that's the institutional innovation. It's kind of interesting. And so I'll finish by talking about the current situation. So Timothy talked about the budget. I think it's really important, given the dire economic situation, to focus on a number of key objectives that are urgent, achievable, that can be benchmarked and evaluated, where the government can be made accountable for. So the elimination of gas subsidies is, of course, a first order, given its effect on both the government debt and the distortions. Market pricing at the margin should apply to both enterprises and households, and one should replace existing subsidies by a lump sum, low price tariff for a minimum consumption level, say 2,000 cubic meter per year at the current price of $80. But these are things that can be done. But something like that could keep the current subsidy level at 10% of its current level without creating a humanitarian crisis. There should be generalized metering of gas and electricity. It seems obvious, but many places it just doesn't happen. One should think of introducing advanced urban heating system, such as the one in Denmark, where heat from industry is used for urban heating, etc., etc. One should introduce a strong and effective competition policy. There really is a danger of oligarchs capturing the new government structures. I think some of what Timothy was talking about is really has to do with that. And then economic growth is not enough part of the debate. It should be pursued as a key objective together with the debt stabilization by encouraging development of small, medium enterprises through easy licensing, encouraging lending, encouraging foreign direct investment. Government intervention will be needed for those objectives, and one has to find ways of avoiding corruption in these measures. Maybe a partial government guarantee for small business loans, etc. But one has to, think in these terms. So to conclude, I would say Ukrainian reforms are doomed to succeed or otherwise the achievements of the Maidan will be undone, Putin will have won, and Ukraine will in all likelihood not have the luck of a third revolution. And so the Russian destabilization in a way is a big challenge because Putin is doing everything to make it fail. But it's also an opportunity because some sacrifices can be asked from the population. Basically, you can call to the unity of the country against the aggression in order to get some of those through. And then I think economists, but lawyers, foreign experts should really help as much as possible, given the scarce local expertise and the bad traditions from the past, both the Soviet and post-Soviet.
Okay, thanks, Gerard. Eric Bergloff has some comments now.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me at a late point in time. So I will, a lot has been said, and I will play mostly the role of what they call in soccer libero, or safety in American football, trying to pick up some loose ends and maybe add some nuances. I do so mostly as a practitioner. I really haven't worked academically on decentralization, but I think there are a lot of, this is a very important area and one that matters a lot for policy. But maybe the first thing we should remind ourselves why Ukraine, because Ukraine is really, of course, a country important in its own right. It's a large country, it's a diversified economy, relatively high human capital. It's important in its own right, but it's also very important for what happens in Russia. So if reforms are successful and the things that Gerard has been talking about are actually implemented in Ukraine, I think that will have a tremendous impact also on Russia. And finally, I think Ukraine is really a litmus test for the European Union and for its ability to exert soft powers in its hinterland. So Ukraine is important for all kinds of reasons. Roger went through the reasons for why decentralization Roger went through the various reasons for decentralization, but I think one should put this in the context, and that's what I will try to do in this short remarks, is that, of course, it matters where you end up on that, the trade-off that Roger is talking about depends a lot on the quality of economic and political institutions. It depends to some degree on differences in preferences. It depends, of course, on the sort of existing political economy. So what are these sort of vested interests at different levels of government? It depends also across different policy areas. So in some areas, it may be much more important to transfer decision-making locally than in others. And finally, I think timing is important. So if we talk about sort of outright decentralization in a situation like the one we have at the moment, where parts of the country are essentially occupied or in some cases indeed occupied, it may not be the right time for a sort of massive decentralization, but it doesn't mean that you cannot work and prepare for such reforms, but probably at the moment trying to do the sort of actual deep implementation maybe very difficult. So why would we like to see decentralization in Ukraine? Well, I think there are two. First of all, what we're talking about is really two aspects. One is the territorial reform, which has to do with consolidating the many small, very diverse entities locally. So there's a need to consolidate to get stronger, more sustainable units at the local level. And of course, then it's about local government reform, what kind of decision making you see in those units. I think what I will say now is very much repeating what Roger said, but it's a way because it's important to have local decisions by people who are most affected by decisions. They're more likely to to be the right decisions. It's a way of improving service of quality of public service delivery. It's also a way in Ukrainian politics to shift away from this kind of regional balance of Ukrainian politics, and Tima spoke about that. There's been a lot about the conflicts between different parts of the country, and that focus has, I think, been very detrimental for both economic and political reforms more generally. And of course, eventually having a vibrant local democracy is critical for national political institutions to prosper, and I think that's very much what comes out of Roger's analysis. But I think it has to be framed, and that's the point that I think should not be missed, is it has to be framed in a sort of larger nation-building project. So it's not, decentralization has to be part of a richer story which links to the various factors that matter for whether such decentralization is valid. So you need to work also very much on improving the quality of political and economic institutions at the same time. So I think I was going to say something about sort of the basic features of Ukraine that you need to keep in mind when you implement decentralization reforms, but I think they have been mentioned certainly by Shahab. So the question is, with this history of sort of failed reforms, of both in terms of general political reforms and economic reforms, but also specifically, there were earlier tries to decentralize decision-making in Ukraine. Why should we think it's different this time? Again, the arguments have been mentioned, but I think it's useful to try to summarize them. I think for those who have been working, and I've been privileged to work in Ukraine very intensely over the last year, you really see that this time it's different. Whether it will be enough, it's a different story, but there is a new sense of national identity. There is a much stronger embrace of the European vector by a larger part of the population. There is a radicalized civil society, probably more radical than in any other country in Europe. And this was all, I think, manifested in the recent parliamentary elections, with the very strong support for the European Association Agreement, the rejection of nationalism and the extreme right, the renewal of politics. So the Self-Help Party got in from basically nowhere and became the third largest party, and a very healthy force, I think, for politics in Ukraine. There are two important political actors, and Tima said something about the problems, and I agree very much with what he said. I think we still have to work with that situation, and we have to find ways of, when we implement reforms of any kind, we have to take that into account. One thing that also came out of the elections, unfortunately, is that Eastern Ukraine is not really on board for broad political reform. So what are the? So I'm going to say a few words about ending with what should we think about when we implement reforms, because that has been so what I've been focusing on in Ukraine, and I've been involved in trying to organize sort of a constitutional convention in miniature of 350. We had 300 people in Kiev for 3 days, and trying to from all kinds of parts of society and from global Ukrainians as well, and several of you in the room here were there, and and then we tried to come up with sort of reform architecture. And I'll say just a few words about that before I start. So what you need to think about, I think, when you look at reform architecture and it's come up, and it's very important, is this unclear division of roles between the president and the prime minister. So there is a decision to go back to the 2004 constitution, but what we have in effect is a dual executive power structure. And that has all the elements that Tima was talking about, but it's a fact of life, and we need to design reforms and a reform architecture that takes that into account. So that's not unique to Ukraine. There are many countries that have that and manage to live through it. It may not be ideal, but something that will be there for the foreseeable future. We have a coalition government, so there are formally 5 parties, but in practice, I guess it's 2 or 3 parties that really matter. But there's also a strong technocratic representation in the government, which again is a very small part of the ministries, but it's still, I think, a very important part. There's a newly elected parliament with many new parliamentary members, but there are also some very unfortunate sediments from the past. There are two dominating and mostly imperfectly aligned leaders, so we need to, again, deal with the cohabitation. And then there's this entrenched oligarchy and the radicalized civil society. So what we tried to do was to design what we call a National Reform Council, and it was actually had its first constitutional meeting just before Christmas. And the idea there was to try to have a structure that sits between the presidential administration and the government and the Rada, and that has a role of fostering cross-ministerial work on reforms, and that also engages civil society, so that you try to leverage civil society and you try to bring in also special interest groups and the groups like the Vox Ukraine, which is trying to promote reform and discussion in Ukraine. So just let me summarize. So again, I argue that the optimal degree of decentralization depends a lot on the number of things, on the context, and the timing may also matter quite a bit on sort of the general political situation. But it's critical for the system to become less volatile and more sustainable. It has to be framed in a larger nation-building exercise. I think the current government is committed, again, this thin layer on top of the ministerial structures, and in the president, I think they are committed, but there are very deep challenges of vested interest. And what's key is to find structures that can, on the one hand, accept the current constitutional situation, but can still promote the actual reform. So that's what I want to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. So then we have Andre.
Yes, thanks for having me here. I'm honored to be here among you. My involvement with Ukraine really began in something around April, May last year. And prior to that, I spent my entire career in policy and regulatory sphere. So I'm trained in finance. I'm at MIT Sloan. My work, finance is a rapidly growing new field, as you know, that hasn't been around for that long. But so what finance does is that it studies and shows how to allocate capital resources among different states and different times, so states of the world and across time. So only until 40 years ago, governments could not actually borrow in international capital markets. They had to rely entirely on their own finances. Now, with the explosive growth in finance, governments can go and borrow, which eventually leads to crisis, banking crisis, government crisis, and all sorts of things. So it's a field that's also the financial system is often evolves as a sort of a natural oligopoly. It's sort of a hub and spoke system, and both globally and in different countries. And so my work primarily in my career had to do with countries that were one of the spokes that lost access to the international capital markets. And when that happens, and I worked for 12 years at the International Monetary Fund, going to different countries. When that happens, it's sort of similar to when, imagine that all your credit cards and debit cards stop working. So you have to figure out, what to do now. You have to change to cash. You have to figure out how you pay your rent, pay your expenses, pay all sorts of things. And countries get into this situation periodically, and so there is no sort of natural reason for the countries to develop this expertise, but international financial institutions is where the expertise accumulates. So next time a country gets into trouble like that, people come and say, here's what works, don't try to reinvent things. And in 2008, one of the hub points, the United States, ended up in a situation that lost access to international capital markets. And I joined the US government and worked for a US federal regulatory agency that had to do with cleaning up the OTC derivatives mess. So I was a chief economist and was in charge of economic analysis of a lot of the rules that have to be written. So when the Maidan happened, and I saw that innocent people are being killed, and then the government came into place, I volunteered my services as an expert to the new government. I said, look, I have a lot of experience dealing with countries that lose access to international capital markets. That's the situation you're in, and maybe I could come and help as a volunteer. So they said, sure, come on over and help. So I flew over to Kiev in May. I hardly spent any time in my professional career ever in Ukraine. So, I arrived, and 2 hours later had a minute meeting with the Deputy Minister of Finance, and the conversation went like this. He said, okay, we signed a $17 billion program with the IMF. We need the money. We have no idea what we signed. Could you tell us what's inside the program? I said, sure, give me 24 hours. So I looked at the program. I've seen many of them. So, and in 24 hours, I said, well, here's the program. It's very weak. It's been written up over 2 days on someone's knee. But use the weakness in your favor. Here's what you need to do. It's a macroeconomic stabilization program. It's not a program of structural reform or economic growth. From the point of view of the international financial system, if the Ukraine stabilizes at zero growth for the next 10 years, they stop the bleeding wound. Your problem is to grow at 5 or 7% a year. So here's how you do it within the context of this situation. They said, this is great. The word started spreading. I started talking to the people at the central bank, various other people. 2 or 3 weeks into it, I realized that I'm talking to the wrong people. I am transferring my expertise and advice to the people who are actually the root of the problem. They're the ones who have all the power, and they're completely unchecked. And the capacity to govern is non-existent. I mean, lots of people are talking about schemes and all sorts of other ways, but not about how to sort of govern. So at the same time, I noticed that there's a tremendous outpouring of sort of horizontal volunteering effort in the country. The state does not basically provide the services that it's supposed to provide. It's supposed to defend its citizens against enemies, foreign and domestic. It does not. It has no army. It has corrupt police. But people have created National Guard units themselves, volunteer units that went and faced regular Russian troops. They have highly complex logistical supply lines that are also volunteer run, and that works, right? So there are people who form the volunteer units who go instead of police patrols and patrol areas. There are people who've sort of designed this horizontal units that really provide the services that the state is supposed to provide that it does not. However, the state charges a lot of money for its services. So one of the things I said, look, I sense that there is a lot of strength in the society as a whole, but this sort of vertical units, the state units, are completely dysfunctional. They're just sort of remnants of whatever, some post-imperial, post-colonial efforts, and there is no real reason to empower them. So what I started giving sort of lectures and seminars in various places, and people started walking up to me and saying, what can we do to help? And so this sort of network started forming, a network of expertise. And the purpose of this network is really to keep pressure and keep the expertise pressure on the government units, parts of it that, as I said, are mostly dysfunctional and have no idea what they're actually supposed to do, even though the laws are written to tell them what they're supposed to do. And create expertise outside of government that will hopefully eventually translate into something meaningful in terms of state governance. Now, to me, it's an open question. I'm very interested in hearing from people who've spent their careers working on it. How do you translate this horizontal strength and horizontal just sort of efforts into meaningful state governance structures? Decentralization is being offered and as an opportunity to do that. Basically, it has a lot of it has a lot of components that resonate with me. In particular, it has the component of competition. It has a component of transparency. It has a component of credibility, because for one reason or another, it seems that sort of the Ukrainian society is very strong, and it evolved to distrust government bodies, which probably for the most part has been predatory. They just sort of grabbed something and then sent it somewhere else, which is just sort of a natural reaction. So even now, if you put people who are not predatory into predatory government bodies, it's not going to create credibility for them. So as Timothy said, you need to show that something meaningful is happening, and one way to show it is perhaps through this effort. Now, what does it mean, outside of this sort of philosophical exercise? Outside of the philosophical exercise, this means that there are groups of experts that I support that now work on various specific problems within on the budget, for example, and analyzing the budget and writing basically pieces for the local media. There is a group that I support that works on the reform of the central bank, which is not independent, and it should be. There is a small group of experts that works now side by side within the state gas monopoly, Naftagaz, that's trying to understand what the heck is going on inside there. I think, just sort of, it's a direct sort of transfer of expertise to groups outside of sort of the current government structure, so they could learn, figure out how things work. I don't have yet an idea of how to translate that into meaningful governance, so I'd love to hear from the panel and from you what to do.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few questions and then let the speakers respond. We'll take a few more questions. So I'm going to open up. I'm going to open up the first question here, which is there is this argument for decentralization, and it has all these, it can do all these good things, and so I really want to direct this to Roger and Gerard, and if I look at the history of decentralization in the former Soviet Union and Russia, I thought it was a wonderful thing, and yet it's a very vulnerable thing, and in some sense, at least in that case, is very dependent on the graces of the central leaders. So when you start decentralizing in the Soviet Union, even before Russia emerges, Gorbachev is this crazy guy who just for some reason he takes away power from the local Communist Party, and there are these things called the Местные Sovieti, which are this joke institution, and he empowers them and he brings in local elections. And there's wonderful work by a guy, Jeff Hahn at Villanova, showing that really scared local people and made them more responsive. And then did crazy things like had local referendum in the last years of the Soviet Union, letting local people vote. And if you went to Russia in the early 90s, local people, were concerned about getting reelected and did all kinds of things with a very limited tax base to do something for the local constituents. So. And if you look at voting, it's very reflective of differences in tastes at the city and the local, the provincial level. And so I thought there were wonderful things about decentralization. But again, it was at the graces, I think, of strong central leadership. And Putin comes along, and he's a strong central leader. And he for what I can see, he really reversed a lot of those good things. So I'd like to know, what is it that you can do, to ensure that kind of decentralization happens and is not so reversible. All right, so that's my question. Maybe we'll take a few others, and then we'll let these guys respond. Barclay?
Well, that's a very specific sort of question, but it certainly relates to the decentralization issue. So after Putin got Crimea, we had this move into 3 oblasts at the same time. We sort of had these seizures of government buildings in the capitals, and so we had Luhansk, Donetsk, and then Kharkiv. And then somehow, very quickly, it seems that, Roger or somebody was talking about, well, these demonstrations, these local government. Somehow the authorities of Kharkiv, which is as Russian-oriented as I can tell as the other 2, they came in and threw those guys out.
Yep.
Very quickly.
That's what was left.
And then in the other 2, they had them. So Luhansk is effectively now Lugansk. And that stuck. Now, so I'm really kind of wondering what's going to happen in Kharkiv. It's really very far east there. It's very heavily Russian-related. without the rest of Donbass, with Donetsk and so on out of the parliament, and the rest of the country being much more Western oriented, is Kharkiv going to become, if the decentralization, will it sort of stick with Ukraine, or is it in danger of getting gobbled up by Putin's people as well?
I'm supposed to answer because I have less to lose, or what?
We'll take one more question, and we'll Sergey. Yeah.
Very interested by Andrei's talk about those group of experts, and I'm sure that Roger will answer the question. I'm not a great expert on, how the American Revolution happened, but it seems to me, from what I know at least, what I read when museums in Boston, that there were these groups of people writing some things, and then somehow that translated into state governments, and then the representatives of the states got together and formed the United States of America. So that there should be a way of taking these expert groups and making, basically what you need to do is replace the government by those people, right? So whether this takes another revolution or not, I don't know. But yeah, I would really like to hear Roger's take on this, how you take this and how you translate this into governance.
All right, so we have 3 questions. We'll get the responses, and then we'll start Tima.
I'll answer Kharkiv. So I do not know, but the intercepts of radio communications of the separatists suggest, which I personally listened to, suggest that they have failed to establish support from the local law enforcement agencies. The reasons for that are unclear. I don't know the reasons why law enforcement agencies didn't cooperate. Okay. Also, in the early periods of this, the people on the ground who were involved in fighting suggested the following account of the events: that the weapons were supplied by the outside of the country, so by the foreign, whereas the financing, direct financing in cash, in hryvnias, for the fighters, for the recruitment, was supplied by local oligarchs. Right? So now that's not inconsistent with some continuous stories which we hear now. For instance, there was a recent meeting about why there is no coal being supplied. Okay, so there are in Lugansk and Donetsk territories which are under Ukrainian control. There is coal which can be used to supply to the energy generating stations, but it's not being delivered. Okay. It's not being delivered because the Ukrainian railroad is sabotaging delivery. Now, which one? The local ones, which are the Donetsk Oblast rail station, just not providing carts. Okay, they're not providing carts to deliver coal. So that suggests that there is a real power structure still present in those areas by people who control execution, de facto control executive power. And they have competing interests, and that's why some of the regions work differently. So I do not have, understanding of that details, but that's consistent with the story why Kharkiv didn't go. So that was not in the interest of people who have assets in Kharkiv.
In response to Sergey, the American Revolution was a revolution of 13 provincial assemblies. If you get past the introduction, the first sentence or two have some very short perfunctory statement about human rights. It is a laundry list of complaints by provincial legislators. The fact that the provincial assemblies were forced to meet in inconvenient places is discussed at much greater length than burning of cities. The American Revolution was a revolution of municipal and provincial governments, and the national government that was established in this country had to be decentralized, had to respect. The problem was creating a central government, but there was no. Our founding, a right-wing commentator read one of the things I co-authored with Timothy on Ukraine and said, Meyerson recognizes how smart the founding fathers were in the United States. The truth is, the founding fathers may have been smart guys in this country, but they had no choice. They certainly had no option of creating a centralized presidential regime. There had never been a presidential election until 1790, whereas there had been municipal and provincial elections for 100 years in every or more in every part of the United States before, and therefore decentralized democracy was established and federal power sharing was forced. The United States, so what I think one of the lessons we should be learning when we understand about the foundations of successful democratic regime. I want to quote, Yulia Tymoshenko wrote an article in Al Jazeera in 2011 where she said, you know, I'm looking at the Arab Spring and the failures of democracy in my country, and you know, damn it, you got to learn that it takes democratic civil society first, and that takes centuries to evolve and develop. That's the, you know, and don't try to rush into democracy. Nice words, except for the problem of where does democratic civil society come from, and how do we get going on it, as opposed to, okay, we have to just wait for the clock to go by. No, you have to do something. It developed from local politics. I would say on the budget point of that Andre mentioned, one of the most important questions about budgeting is whether municipalities and municipal governments that are locally elected have a fixed, transparent, non-political budget distributed from the center, because as in most countries, revenue is going to be collected centrally and distributed locally, or are they micromanaged in the budget by the Verkhovna Rada, by the National Assembly? So the decentralization. What was the other question? About Russia. We should recognize, and I'm sorry that Andrew Konitzer wasn't here, because his book is really superb on this. Russia, what he argues, in his absence, I think in essence, is that the failures of Russian decentralization. We should recognize that in December 2004, Vladimir Putin led a centralization in Russia by changing from directly elected oblast provincial governors to having them be presidentially appointed. In this argument, Putin and his supporters in this reform could point to Ukraine, where oh look, the president appoints the governors in Ukraine, let's do the same thing here in Russia. So he was taking Ukraine as a model. There were horrors in local government. We should be very clear, decentralized democracy will increase local corruption. It will decrease. You transfer power, corruption follows the power. However, the point of decentralization is that where there's a better government in some locality, you get an island of better governance, it can spread, because the local elite that's responsible for providing better governance can then put the case to national voters, elect us to national power, and the good government that you have in Lviv or in Kharkiv can now become good government nationally. And ambitious local leaders have an incentive then to start creating better local government. But other not so ambitious local leaders can just steal, and it will happen. What Konitzer argues, I believe in essence, is that the worst excesses of Russian decentralization before 2004 were done by local leaders who had no national party affiliation. So a strong national party system. So not making local leaders subservient to the president, but making them for example, subservient to national parties. For example, a rule that says that one needs to be nominated to be a local governor. You have to be nominated by a party that has, say, at least 10% of the National Assembly. That would be a rule that forces every local governor to have some national party that's responsible for him, and that would be embarrassed, so that his local cheating then embarrasses the party nationally. That's part of it. We have to understand how successful systems work, and it's the linkage. But people are right to confuse federalism and feudalism. Decentralization by itself can just be local feudalism, but a connection between, the goal is to create some local autonomy, but under national law. Let me just say briefly that I think in conversations in Ukraine that one discovers people who are not familiar with how a federal system works don't really understand the logic of how it works. But in those debates, you know, a game theorist can also come to understand what's essential. More importantly, the fact, once we have democracy, democratic elections only in a centralized regime, we have huge vested interests created for the continuation of centralization. It becomes much more difficult to decentralize once there is a democratic election of a national government that has millions of people who have voted for it, but they now have a vested interest in maintaining centralization that they now control. So that the call for a constitutional convention is I think a very important one. But one thing I've learned is that at some point I wanted to say to Ukrainians, you need to listen to not just your national leaders, but also your locally elected leaders. The locally elected leaders but in some sense, that is the essence of constitutional democratic decentralization. The essence is that voters understand that they have elected both local leaders and national leaders, and when there's a conflict between the national and local levels of government, the different levels of government, ultimately that has to be arbitrated. Who's the ultimate court? You can have a constitutional court, but ultimately it has to be arbitrated by the voters. And the voters need to understand that they need to listen to both. And that's the argument that in the constitutional debate, the journalists and voters need to understand. They want to hear how people feel about this. If Kharkiv, I don't know anything about Kharkiv, and I don't know whether I would like or dislike the mayor of Kharkiv if I could meet him. But I do know that the way you would get him to mobilize his local power to prevent a Kharkiv People's Republic coup is by giving him a sense that he would have a better vested interest in the political system within Ukraine than in becoming either a local statelet on its own or part of the Russian Federation. And for that is what decentralization is about. It's about providing a constitutional guarantee that if you can get yourself elected mayor of Kharkiv, you'll actually have some power.
Very quickly, just very quickly on Russia. First of all, it's quite interesting. The criticism of decentralization was based on the fact that many local oblasts were completely captured and were actually sabotaging the reform. Interestingly, the reformers who were calling for centralization, I think Dan Treisman's taste for centralization comes from there. When Putin did it, because he did it, and then they said, "Oh no, this is bad because this is." This is concentrating powers for Putin. So they thought it would be good to have centralization if Yeltsin was in power. It would be bad to have centralization if Putin is in power. That shows the danger, I think, of centralization. That whoever is in power, it's the same thing. Dictatorship, democracy. When the good guys are in power, they have more power. It's good. But when the bad person is in power, then concentration of power is disastrous. Decentralization. Will create, and here I just want to emphasize, will create in some areas, there's going to be capture, there's going to be corruption. But if you have decentralization in a way that empowers local people, and in response to what Andrei said, you want a government institutional change to empower the people who are active in the Maidan. That's really what you want to do. Then decentralization can do that, because then you have all sorts of centers of power. There can be competition. Competition is quite important, because then some people will do the right thing, and then you can compare the good and bad experiences. And hard budget constraints are also important. So I don't want to say too much about that, because it would be too long, but it's also important. In relation to the US, indeed, the US had a completely opposite experience. There, it was not about trying to decentralize and centralize power. It was trying to create some centralization and something that risked being, the Dutch or the Polish system, or what is today the European Union, trying to create something. But I think the US is really an example, because the people who thought through the Constitution, they really had debates. They had deliberations on how best to create a constitution that would not be an elected monarchy. That's what they wanted to avoid. How to defend the country against, British if they would come back, etc. And the Federalist Papers still today is a source of inspiration for anybody who thinks of constitutional reform. And that's why I think, you need something like a process of constitutional change that can institutionalize all these, local initiatives. People debate, they agree on something. Once they, there's not one set of good institutions, but what is really important is that people debate them. There's a consensus on what is to be done, and then they stick by the rules that they chose for it, and then they're proud of them, and they this acts as a focal point, and then these are followed. And that's the experience of all successful constitutions, and I think Ukraine can do it, but again, having good guys in power is not an alternative to really doing this profound institutional change, because in the long run, that's the only thing that's going to work.
Okay, so we're going to get Jan, and we're going to get you, and who else? Okay, so go ahead, Jan.
All right, so I fully agree with the principles that were outlined here, and let's say, starting with the broadly accepted and respected constitution, then institutions that respect the rule of law and diminishes corruption and has the right balance between central and decentralized sort of decision making. And I guess the question is relating to how do the people who are now in the process of trying to implement it, the experts, both internal and external, how do you bring it about? My experience is that you really need strong political parties and movements who stand behind it. And so my question is, given the recent elections and everything, is that situation now present in Ukraine, or will it require another revolution, whatever, revolt of sorts, or change of non-institutional character in order to get to that phase where this can be implemented? Or will this kind of simmer and not get anywhere because the entrenched interests, and we see it even in Central Europe, are just extremely strong. So it's very difficult to implement once you have a system in place, right? So can we move from one equilibrium to another with the current setup that we have?
Okay. What is your name?
Sergey Peredri. Sorry, I forgot my name. So I think I heard the question I want to ask. I think I heard a part of the answer, but I still want to ask it anyway. So it's mainly to Timothy, but I welcome a response from anyway. So how do you reconcile the fact of current external threat that Ukraine faces with the idea of decentralization? And like, if you look at what Putin or Russia historically does, is a divide and conquer tactic, right? So as we have seen with South Stream countries, right, that they try to he tried to put those countries against the EU. And isn't that create a danger of when the local government is elected rather than appointed, that Russia will approach those governments and trying to chop parts of Ukraine away, and it's going to be harder for Ukraine to stay as a country. And I think the second part of the question is, how do you win the public opinion for the decentralization? Because currently the main idea is that united we stand, as in the US, right? So and people are really afraid of this word federalization. So I think the public, public work needs to be public, you need to work with public, right? On the idea of winning public support for decentralization. Thank you.
Okay, one more question. When you ask questions, just tell me your name. Tell us your name.
My name is Alexandra Lefebvre from Harvard.
Thank you.
And my question is just to probe a little more deeply on this question of Russian decentralization. I think there's little disagreement that centralization was not so great, but decentralization was also not so great. And if you look at specific policy areas like health outcomes, for example, decentralization was pretty catastrophic across most regions. So then you ask yourself, why isn't it catastrophic in all regions? What is it that makes certain regions, let's say 4 or 5, well managed when all of the others are not well managed? And it looks like it comes down to good leaders, good individual leaders who for some reason were able to rise to the top of that local political system. And if that's true, it's extremely worrisome when you recommend decentralization, because the success of decentralization may depend on factors that in fact are very tangentially related to institutions. They may relate to whether or not there's a university in the region, for example, that happens to be training specialists that will be good managers, or other factors. And I guess I'd be a little anxious about recommending decentralization without a focus on what specific factors must be present in order for it to produce good results.
Okay. So, you want to just...
Can I answer your question? So, I think it's indeed a question what can be done. I mean, there is the question of normative prescription that we would like to get to those institutions, and then there's a reality of a lot of incompetence, misunderstanding, vested interests, and it's a very complex system. So the question is how to actually administer the change, and to make that change sustainable, that is not reversible later. Now, I'm naive about these things, but my experience is that there's so much distrust in the system that if you try to approach anything head-on by saying, let's do that, because it's good for you, that's not being well received, because people distrust your reasons, and they try to identify you with some political group which is interested in that. So my impression is that a lot of good things are done indirectly. And if we want to decentralize, we actually want to bring people in at the local levels who will be new political leaders, and we want to bring good people. Now, we can go about convention. We can set up convention, and we can try to do it top to the bottom, but there will be fights over who controls the agenda on that convention. And people who will execute their power over the control are actually very powerful, not only in terms of direct methods, but also in terms of control and media narrative. Right? So that's always is a danger. Now, if you go indirectly and use what is out there happening and where these vested interests or competing political interests are worried about, you can try to leverage that. So there's local elections coming up, and everyone is concerned that one of the three major players, so new parties and presidential party and prime minister's party and also maybe opposition bloc, that one of them will gain strength as a result of having control, as a result of local elections. If they get their people in the local elections, they will be more powerful. So that suggests that everyone will have some incentives towards bringing some kind of balance through the local elections. That's where you can try to leverage that to bring new leaders at the local level. And the parties might be agreeing to that compromise. Now, de facto, that will be decentralization, but because you will give voice to the locals, to the new leaders. And from that, you can then see how those people would be interested in. You will now have stakeholders who want decentralized power. Now, you don't have those stakeholders. We have been talking about this. Where are those local leaders who would stand up and say decentralized? And they're not there. A couple of them were in the East, but they were murdered. But there are really not that many local leaders who can stand up. Okay? So you want to bring them, and you can use the current composition, current composition of political interest to bring those new leaders during the local elections. You don't need to do much, but that requires very careful understanding of this structure. So it's a dirty work. You have to. It's hard. There are no easy decisions. Okay, and I think Roger would be better suited to answer the question why decentralization is not necessarily weaken the ability to protect the country, but in fact can strengthen that. That's a typical question, and there is a good answer. I think people fear not federalization in Ukraine. People fear that the local oligarchs who were paying, whoever else, but not local people, they would gain power as a result of that process. And that's what opponents of decentralization try to leverage again to prevent. When they go into media and they try to set up the narrative that there is this bad guy now, he's an enemy of Ukraine, and that guy now will be in power. We don't want that to happen, and the discussion shuts up. So you can undo that again, but you need to work with media. But I think Roger is in a much better position to explain why decentralization might actually strengthen the country rather than weaken it.
I had a specific discussion in Kiev about whether David Galula's book on counterinsurgency is publicly available in Russian translation, because David Galula, at the core of counterinsurgency theory, argues that counterinsurgency state building is in his words, to summarize it in one sentence, and that's what we should know, is building a political machine, he said, from the population upward, from the community level, building community level grassroots support. And I was told the Russians are doing that pretty well in their part of Donetsk, but the Ukrainians, of course, are sending in agencies directed from Kiev. And I think it's very important as we talk about the realities of building a state, that when Timothy talked about popular local leaders being murdered, that it's absolutely of the essence of the matter that some share of responsibility for local policing should be devolved to locally elected governments, so that you know that if you can get yourself elected mayor, at least you can have some control, which is not to say that there shouldn't also be a national police force and that the national government shouldn't be involved. On the question of decentralization and the harm, as I've already, of course there'll be incompetent local governments when local governments are more responsible, as there are incompetent national administrative agencies. But one of the things, there's so much disinformation about decentralization. One should emphasize democratic decentralization, democratic federalism is not Balkanization. That I like to cite in Ukraine that Austria is an example of a federal, the Bundesrepublik Austria. It's a federal republic. 10% of the public spending roughly is at the municipal level, 25% at the provincial level, and 65% at the national level. That's what I mean by federalism. So there should be, if there are regions where local public health agencies are incompetent, then national public health agencies need to do more work there. And that is important. That is a problem. But federalism, that emphasizes federalism is complicated, reaching an understanding about where are the boundaries between what the national government does, and it's not just local election, it's that 35% of the budget roughly that's being decentralized to municipal and provincial level governments has to be non-politically allocated. It has to be either they are directly taxing on their own authority, or they are getting national revenues by a transparent, non-political revenue sharing formula that is absolutely the essence of the matter as part of the constitutional system. And let me just say that on the question of how do we get there, I believe that I don't know when the local elections are scheduled for, but my most hopeful scenario on building decentralization in Ukraine would be that if the local elections across the entire nation bring a focus on statements by candidates for local office, if that news event, those news events bring local officials into the national constitutional debate, that to me is the best hope for getting that debate, which will also involve prime ministers, leaders of the 5 major parties, and of course the president most of all. But if those people who expect that their part of the political system will be to sit in municipalities as mayors or city councils or oblast or rayon level council members, those people should be if those voices start getting heard in the decentralization reform debate and become an important part of a national constitutional debate, that to me that's really how democratic federalism is built, and that's the most optimistic step. I hope, before saying that, I want to say voxukraine.org, that's the most important thing I can say. Go to voxukraine.org.
I'd like to maybe add a little bit.
Let me let Eric respond.
No, just one issue that Roger was asking, why is that federalism has such a bad name in Ukraine? Well, it has to do with that this is a word term used by Russians to basically denote something that would have elements of veto powers of the individual parts of the system. So a bit like Bosnia, the Dayton Accord and so on. And I think that's what it was a concern, and that's why people don't like this word, and particularly don't like this to be decided by some powers outside Ukraine. So anyhow, so to Jan's question, is there any genuine support? I'm a bit more optimistic than but I don't have his deep understanding of the Ukrainian politics. But just a few days ago, the first new laws were presented to the Rada on decentralization. I think there is a genuine commitment in the government program to this. I don't want in any way to minimize the resistance to this, and there are all kinds of resistance. There's a concern in the Rada that the way it's being implemented now, that it will benefit the president and undermine the role of the Rada. So that's that. That's of course also at the local level. There are genuine concerns from units that will be merged with other units that there will be, particularly in the beginning, maybe less access to public services and so on. And this is something that's very familiar for similar reforms in other countries, something one has to get over with, that over time you get much higher quality of healthcare, for example, if you can have larger units and so on. But so that there is resistance, there have been resistance in the past, and when they tried this in 2006, 2008, that was one of the main issues that prevented that from happening. Just one point on this external threat. As I alluded to it, and I am concerned that at a time when that differences in attitudes and are sort of heightened because of the what's going on at the moment, and where you have sort of amplified distinctions that maybe didn't matter so much in the past, that is a very sensitive time to do this. I mean, so I'm not saying that we should just be aware of it, that things that maybe didn't matter so much 2 years ago matters a lot now because of what has transpired in terms of the sort of military conflict and so on. So it is a very inflamed situation in which to implement these reforms, and I think we should just be aware of it.
So just maybe a few words on the defense and decentralization. I'm not an expert on it, but one way to just sort of think about how you can build a better foundation for defense and at the same time decentralize is, I mean, I think it's pretty much becoming clear that external defensive shields over Ukraine are dysfunctional, so Ukraine needs to build its own defensive capacity. Now, my feeling is that one way to build it is to have a small, highly professional and very well equipped federal military, and then have large National Guard units that are financed by local municipalities. And because they'll have very different just sort of functionality, but at the same time it will spread, it will be sort of direct example of decentralization. You have National Guard units that are in charge of making sure that things like that happen in Donetsk and Lugansk don't happen. They're conscripted or attracted or paid for by your local money. They are now part of they're now sort of more stakeholders in the system, so that it could be done in a sort of a similar context. It doesn't have to be we built one ginormous federal army that is now empowers the president, but could be taken over by one of these new, opportunistic combats, and now we have a military coup in Ukraine. So that's sort of another reason of how it could be avoided.
Sure.
Yeah. So just to be a bit more concrete on, again, I'm not, the most knowledgeable, but if you look at the composition of the current parliament compared to the previous parliament, it's a total change. The party of the region was, laminated. Timoshenko's party, who was kind of, at the time of the Orange Revolution, was kind of, the vanguard, also on the side. So you have, the two main parties of the president and prime minister, but you also have this new party that I don't know very well, Samopomic, but it seems interesting. Seems to be part of the emanation of the Maidan movement. And so there's, already the fact that, with the annexation of Crimea, with all the destabilization, that presidential elections took place, that parliamentary elections took place, that there was, very little evidence of fraud, already is a success. And I think I want to reinforce what was said about local elections. It could very well be that local elections are going to bring a sea change. And I fully agree that maybe the constitutional change will come, or the stimulus will come after the local elections, because that's going to be important. And if all the people who participate in the Maidan, instead of going fighting in eastern Ukraine, if they really participate in these local elections and then they get to positions of power, I think there's really going to be a big change. One thing that's really not easy to understand is that if you think you have to understand about states. The Ukrainian state was basically the Soviet states, part of the Soviet system of controlling people, of making people obey. When that system collapsed, this was seen as positions of power where people could help themselves to steal, grab, etc. And so people want a new state, a state that comes where its powers come from the people, where they deliver public goods, for the people. That's going to imply conflict. That's going to imply mistakes. That's going to imply incompetence in some areas. But that's democracy. That's democracy. And the aspirations for democracy are extremely strong, and they have not abated. They have not abated. Look at I think it's better these days to be in Ukraine than in Hong Kong. Being aspiring to democracy in Ukraine and Hong Kong, I think your chances are probably higher.
Okay, we're gonna take 3 more questions, and then we're gonna have to wrap up. So Hartmut. Hartmut, yeah. No, wasn't. I'm sorry. Who was that?
Me, I am.
So please tell us your name and.
My name is Omar Abedi. I'm affiliated to George Mason University. I have a question for Roger about the benefits of decentralization. I'm actually from Bahrain. I know this is about Ukraine, but the Middle East has lots of pertinent issues to the Ukraine at the moment. In particular, I would say one of the perceived weaknesses of decentralization is that it promotes identity politics, given that people of either similar set, race, or tend to live close to each other. And in recent past, there's this perception that foreign powers are trying to promote decentralization as a way of balkanizing through the back door, with Iraq being the most obvious example, where decentralized power occurs has had a role in leading to the disintegration of what is considered traditionally one of the most powerful Arab countries, and then Lebanon, over the last 50 years, slowly through identity politics, losing a lot of power, and now similar things being proposed, or have been proposed for Syria and Libya. So I was wondering if I don't know to what extent identity politics is a risk in Ukraine, but just as a general theoretical point.
Okay. Any other questions? Coney Shores.
I have a question where I want to compare with Poland. So if you look at Ukraine, when Ukraine starts to live, say, you're equally rich as Poland. Now Poland is 3 times richer. One of the theories could be that Ukraine has been more as a failed state because of the fact it's too centralized, and that's the story we tell here. But another story could be that Poland has been anchoring institutions, the European Union institutions, while Ukraine has been oscillating, looking to the west and the east with different presidents, and they have been kept doing this forever. And in that sense, the revolutions and the fact that Tymoshenko is in jail, they're all just in the nature of the fact that the country could not be set where to go, to the west or east. So my question is, to what extent should the European Union try to be involved and try to anchor Ukraine's institutions as it did with Poland's institutions?
One more question? We can,
I've probably spoken too much, but I'll thank you for addressing to me. Let me say, when I wrote something in 2011 in response to Yulia Tymoshenko's article in Al Jazeera, I was specifically addressing both Ukraine and the Arab Spring. And I said at that time that I thought if one to get serious about creating civil society in Ukraine, Yulia Tymoshenko should have been then and should be now advocating decentralization, and that if the democratic leaders of the Arab Spring needed to address the question which was then already in the constitution in Egypt of holding local elections, and I've noted that in Egypt in 3 constitutions, in Mubarak's constitution, in Morsi's constitution, and now in Sisi's constitution, all 3 constitutions of Egypt promise democratic decentralization at some point in the future, but say we're going to put it off for now, because those who are in power at the national level pat themselves on the back, say we're the good guys, and we will, some of our most important positions are the patronage positions are the appointments of mayors and governors, and so it's very difficult to shake that. I agree that where ethnic divisions exist, that tends to undermine the benefits of decentralization in an important way. For one thing, a successful local governor finds it hard to run for national office if he's viewed only as being the representative of a local ethnic group and not someone who could serve the population in general. I think some of the difficulties of Nigerian federal democracy come from the fact that it is a highly ethnically divided society. They speak many different languages. Everybody speaks Russian in Ukraine, I believe, at least badly. It may not be their native language, but I do not believe that Ukraine is more ethnically divided than the United States of America, for example, which has divisions, and they cause some serious problems in our history. But I've tried to argue earlier that it is the unique constitutional structure where a national election chooses a president, one of whose principal powers is the power to control local governments, polarizing regional extremism in Ukrainian politics, not any long-term traditions from dating back centuries of rivalries between ethnic East and West. Finally, on Poland versus Ukraine, I think Poland was one of the best countries in decentralizing in the transition from the Soviet system, but everybody recognizes that in the transition from communism, the #1 factor for explaining what countries were able to make a good transition to better governance was hope of joining the EU, and we should remind ourselves that.
So I just follow where Roger ended. I think clearly this has been important and a lot of work on this. So looking at this statement, it depends. So, it's not independent of what framework the European Union offers to Ukraine, because it's not. I think we're not talking about membership, so it's something else. So this power of the anchor is determined to what is in the offer and when and so on. I mean, we know that, but of course it also depends on the policies pursued in Ukraine. And here, as Roger was saying, Poland is really the model that now the Ukrainian reformers are using. Exactly their experience of merging local administrative units and transferring the regional, transferring decisions to local bodies. So I think that combination. So right now, I think there is a much stronger support in Ukraine for EU accession or EU association than ever before. And I think there is also genuinely in the European Union a greater willingness to discuss other forms of arrangements than we've had in the past. Having said that, of course, when you look at what's been going on now in terms of trying to support Ukraine in terms of financial support, the willingness of the European Union to contribute has been, I'm talking not only about the European Union as such, but also bilateral support from EU members have been very slow in coming and doesn't seem to actually come to the amounts that's necessary.
I'd like to maybe also say something that's tangentially related to Poland and Ukraine. But I think that in addition to having just a formal institutional sort of collaboration, I think a huge influence, at least from my experience, has been sort of a soft influence of socializing all sorts of interested people, including leaders, with internationally. To give you an example, so it doesn't necessarily have to be in EU, but Timothy said, let's put these people in place. We actually don't know who these local leaders are going to be, but if whoever this is going to be, whatever it's going to work out, if these people are able to go and meet with some people in Poland, in the US, and socialize them, just socialize lots and lots of people, give them access to the ability to learn. I'll give you an example. The current governor of the Central Bank of Ukraine, she's not prepared to be the governor. It takes decades to build the governor of the Central Bank. Okay, it takes a long, long time and a lot of training. But she was extremely thrilled when she was in DC after meeting with Stan Fisher, who was in the pantheon of governors, successful governors. That's what you want to see. You want these people, you want them to feel like, okay, we can get access to that, we can talk to them, we can, talk to a Nobel Prize laureate, he's coming here. We don't actually know who, it's a sausage factory, as has been rightly said. We don't know who is going to end up where. But if they feel that there is external socialization, there's ability to get access, information, knowledge, to connect to the wider world, it will work out. Something will work out. Somebody will see that it makes more sense, it's more profitable, it makes a lot more over time sense to connect to this wider world than steal a little bit now, locally. Right, and that's sort of the idea. So outside of the formal structure, EU, Ukraine, this may or may not work out. It may take time, whatever. But locally, lots of people, and by all of us, should be socialized in whatever way we can.
Yes, so just rapidly make 2 points. I don't think decentralization creates identity politics. I think, you know, part of it is there for some reason. And actually decentralization helps to reduce conflict based on ethnic or identity, etc. Because you know, places that are heterogeneous have their own democracy, power, etc., and they don't interfere. So you know, in African countries you have big conflicts because the state is centralized, and then some group is repressed, and because it's centralized, you know, it leads to conflict. I did a book on the European Parliament and with two co-authors, and we found that in the European Parliament the coalitions are mostly left-right, which we thought was surprising. Why isn't it based on nations? And the answer is pretty simple, but when you think about it, it's that because most of the powers belong to the nations. They don't belong to Europe. And so it's only things that they agree to do together that there they have disagreements. Should we do it more in a left-wing or a right-wing way? And you know, that's kind of peacefully doing things together. I won't add anything on the EU. It's always striking that the grass is always greener from the outside. That people inside the EU, they see all the problems, but outside the EU, the dream of being part of the EU is such a strong thing. But the EU is a haven of peace and prosperity, and in the long run, it's a big success. And Europeans should understand, the attraction that it has. And without the EU, maybe probably the Maidan would not have taken place.
Timo's going to have the last comment now.
Yeah, I just want to, first I want to address one little issue, that I'm not pessimistic on Ukraine, okay? I might sound that. I just don't, I'm extremely optimistic. I just want to convey the message that there is no easy solutions, okay? And the vested interests are strong, and one needs to think carefully about how to implement things, on top of having a clear agenda of where we want to go. The second one is that decentralization is very important because for additional specific reason, the vested interests are not very well developed in Ukraine. They're very powerful, but they're not institutionally strong. The country is not strong institutional, and so vested interests are not strong. They work the same way the country works. It's trusted person, and a couple of trusted persons, and everything else for cash. Okay? So they don't have institutions within the vested interests. So they're gonna run out of capacity controlling specific people if you decentralize power. As long as they have their 2 or 3 centers of power, they can access this, ручное управление, this hands-on. They can make phone calls to the trusted people and something like that. The moment you truly start the institutions throughout the country at the local level, they will collapse because they won't have enough capacity to subvert all of this. And that's also an important thing to understand, how the vested interests function in Ukraine.
Okay, well, so thanks. I just want to make one more point that if this has sparked your interest, or you already have an interest, you should go to voxukraine.org, voxukraine.org, and all these debates and things will be there. Thank you very much for participating.